Okay. Time for another question. Okay, let's start there and then we'll come to you. Yes. We'll do 2 questions before the next 2. Yes.
Go back to the most recent.
Microphone, yeah. Yeah.
To go, the most recent work that many of us might have seen was the Documenta 13.
Yes.
And it was the first time I saw you playing such an active part. How often does that happen? And could you talk a little bit more about the work? I saw it as a very celebratory work and sort of like...
The piece that was at Documenta was an installation of 5 projections in a room a little bit bigger than this space with different megaphones which had me talking in them. So if you wanted to hear what I was saying, you could stand under a megaphone. Otherwise, there was a sound that went all the way around. And it was an investigation of different ways of thinking about time and the different ways we turn time into something material. And at first it was a scientific project about different scientific ways of thinking about time, from Newton to Einstein to thinking about black holes and the end of time. But in the end it also became very much about thinking about fate and trying to escape one's fate. It became about generations of fathers and sons came into it. But what it did is it used the language of science to generate the metaphors of the piece. And what we discovered that the closer we got to the actual science history and science theory, the richer and more evocative the metaphors became. So we were certainly not trying to explain relativity to an audience. But for example, Einstein, when he writes about relativity, uses as his very famous example twin brothers, one traveling through space at high speed and the other staying on the Earth, and their clocks run at different speeds. One ages very quickly and the other ages very slowly. So this immediately puts us in mind of the different speed that time has to kind of run away. It also has the idea of you staying in one place, but watching your life spread out and go through this long journey and come back to yourself. So there were those kinds of ideas. There was an astonishing story in 1889. A French anarchist tried to blow up time. And he did this, again, metaphorically, by trying to blow up the Greenwich Meridian. He took a bomb to the Greenwich Observatory to try to blow up the prime meridian, to make a stand against the globalization of science. And he blew himself up before he blew up the observatory. But Joseph Conrad used his story to write The Secret Agent. And then 20 years ago, there was the Unabomber in America, the small-scale anarchist who was trying to blow up all the GPS satellites and the scientists who made them. And he'd been a great fan of Conrad and got his idea from The Secret Agent. So it had gone from history to fiction back into the world. And all of them as a purely metaphoric act to try to make a statement about the globalization of time. So that was the background. But in the course of making that, we made many short films, different film fragments. One's about a zoetrope. Let me find... So this was an idea of being stuck in time. Again, like a flip book, a zoetrope is an old pre-cinematic device in which one action is completed and repeated. And so this was an idea of both moving through time. It's moving, so it's going through time, but it's always stuck in the same place. So it's both about walking round and round the studio, but it's also about a desire towards a narrative that never happened. So as this action repeats itself, there's a kind of a hope that next time round, something will happen. And the metronomes, of course, are an extra layer of thinking about things in sync and out of sync. So this was music that had been written for a completely different project, but added on top of this to see what it did. the same thing with some of the tango music, like the tango we listened to in the flipbook. None of these used in the final project like this, but interesting for how one sees and hears in a different way.
Isikotisi yamshi, isikotisi yapel, isikotisi yamshi.
So even though you obviously know it's just one frame, one climbing over a chair once, there is a sense both of the fitness of the walker who can hurdle so effortlessly for so long, and the kind of thing, will he trip? Will something happen? Even though you know nothing is going to happen, there's part of you that is wishing for something to happen. And because I was giving the lectures in the project, and that part of it exists as a performance piece of a lecture, a bit similar to this lecture, I was used as one of the characters in the project. But let's go to another. You had a question.
I had a question about the magic flute.
Okay.
This is what I saw at the MoMA frames, and there was one on the magic flute, which showed an installation that you had made, and then I wanted to see how that came about. Is that a big question?
No, it's a fine question. I'm just quickly going through my head. I've got one fragment that we can look at here that relates to it. So the Magic Flute is the opera that Mozart writes in 1791, his last great opera. And in it there's the character of Zarathustra, who is the high priest of light, and he instructs Tamino the prince to go and rescue Pamina the princess and destroy the queen of the night. And it's, in one sense, you can say it's a version of Plato's myth of the cave, of someone coming from darkness into light, and the whole metaphor of light equaling understanding and darkness equaling ignorance. So it's 1791, which you have to realize is the time of the French Revolution. Zarathustra, who has a combination of monopoly of knowledge and violence in the same way, is a Robespierre, who would have seen himself as Zarathustra. And so one of the things that is clear between 1791, when Mozart writes the opera now, is what a completely dangerous combination is. That is, someone who believes they have total knowledge and who has a monopoly of power. And every kind of tyrant in the world has been, in a way, a Zarathustra. So while Mozart could write of him as this very hopeful utopian character, the experience of us afterwards is very different. And the idea of those, the initiates with knowledge, bringing their knowledge to the darkness, is of course a kind of a description, if you like, of colonialism, the way in which colonialism described itself, bringing the light of Europe to the benighted people in Africa. And we understand also in retrospect the disaster and damage and violence that involved. So part of the project was taking it on Mozart's terms, the optimistic view of the Enlightenment in 1791, and the other was looking at the political underbelly of what the Enlightenment also brought, which was to look at an example of the most depraved state of colonialism, which was the genocide of the Hereros by the Germans in Southwest Africa in 1904, a genocide in which 85% of that population was killed. So there were two pieces. There was a miniature theatre which showed the Mozart's Magic Flute, and another miniature theatre that had fragments from this other event. But I only got to the other event having spent 2 years simply doing a production of Mozart's opera, which was done as a conventional production in an opera house, but then has a second life in this miniature theatre allied to the other miniature theatre of black box of the genocide. So in that way, I very often am not certain of what the end state will be, not just to say what the end opera will look like, but if the final production of the opera is the end state of the whole project. From the Magic Flute? I do. I have to find it in, we go back to here, and then it's in the thing called folders to be sorted out. And it's 2/3 down on the right. here. And here I can show you. Okay, I can show one of the things that's important about the studio, another fact of the studio that's vital. It's both the space for making knowledge, but it also has to be a safe space for stupidity, which is essential. Not to think, oh God, is this action, is this drawing, is this film ridiculous, but to allow anything to happen in the studio and later on assess its validity, its interest, whether it brings other thoughts. And so this is a fragment of developing part of the film for Magic Flute, and I feel very reluctant, but I will show you because it is, think of it more as a demonstration of the essentialness of stupidity in the studio. So this was trying to work out what on earth we should be doing. So this is the first day of thinking what kind of movements could the performer have. He's talking about being a bird catcher, putting nets up and things to catch the different witch, and if he could find a little bird it would be like finding a wife. And he has a panpipe that he blows.
Was wär ich? Wo bin ich?
Okay, that gives a sense of that. And there's one other fragment from Magic Flute I can show you. So this had to do with trying to, in the opera, Mozart writes about the magic of the flute taming wild beasts. It's an opera about the power of music. And this was trying to work out how and how one works with the beast. But it also had to do with the nature of recognition. I'm talking about if one starts with a series of random black shapes, initially you can just see them as abstract black shapes. But that at a certain point, as the pieces come together, they stop being simply a shape and you recognize a rhinoceros on a balloon. And at a certain point, it doesn't have to be about a voluntary seeing in or saying I'm going to force myself to see a shape or recognize a shape. It's about the shape coming towards you and meeting something in you that makes that moment of recognition. So even if one doesn't know how, you can give this to a 6-year-old and say, if you say to them, draw me a rhinoceros standing on its back legs, that's very hard. But if you give them these fragments of paper and tell them, make a rhinoceros on its back legs, you move them about until you recognize what it is that you have been making. So this category of recognition rather than knowledge is also an essential one in the studio, either with an image like this or with the whole structure of a film that you might make. So this was the start of the way of thinking about the rhinoceros in the piece. And this is the projection for the sequence of taming of the animals. Okay, that was Magic Flute. Okay. Yes, a question here? Do you need the microphone? I think wait for the microphone.
We have seen that you've used a unique and painstaking technology of animation. Now, how did you develop it? I mean, from drawings to animation, and does it reflect a rejection of or aversion to new technology?
No, it doesn't reflect that. The question of how did I arrive at the animation. I think with most of the things that I've done have come not necessarily by chance, but in spite of myself. With the charcoal animation, I'd been making charcoal drawings and then decided I would like to see what a drawing looks like as it is made. So I set up a camera and started filming the drawing frame by frame as I was drawing it to see what are the stages when a drawing is at its most energetic, at its most interesting. And then I discovered as the drawing was made by erasing and adding that I didn't need to stop, that the drawing didn't ever need to end. It could continue to develop. And I discovered that I had made a piece of animation and a piece of film. Rather than me deciding I want to do an animated film, what technique would be most effective. So it came out of the materials I had been using already and then brought with it a whole series of themes, ideas, what it carried in its train. But those were brought to me rather than me imposing them on it.
So do you draw every frame?
I don't draw every frame. I do the drawing once. Like I draw the landscape with a mind dump, and I shoot 2 frames, a 1/12 of a second, and then walk to the drawing and erase a bit of the mind dump, and walk back to the camera and shoot 2 more frames, and do that 12 times, and then I've got 1 second of time. So a sequence of that whole mind dump collapsing, which may take 20 seconds, would be 500 frames, would be 250 alterations of the drawing, but 1 drawing. And so there, in one sense, it's a slow way of making a drawing, but it's quite a quick way of making animation. And it also means that I don't need a studio of people. And that's essential. If you have a studio of people or people doing it, you've got to know what you're doing. You've got to tell them what they should be doing. And I need to structure a space for me to be uncertain and not knowing where it's going or why I'm doing it. I tried once to work with an assistant in the studio shooting the frames as I drew them, but 3 things happened that weren't good. The first is that I got embarrassed and anxious about the length of time the person was standing doing nothing, so I started drawing faster and faster to try to. The second thing was that instead of walking back to the camera each time, I'd simply step aside from the frame out of the drawing so it could be photographed and then go back in. And what that meant was that I lost that glance at the drawing every time you turn at the camera and see it and take your frame and walk back. And that glance and that walk, both of those things, were vital. And the third thing I discovered was that when there was someone else watching me draw, however much I tried, I kept on saying, I'd better look like I'm drawing. I'd better act like an artist. And so I'd suddenly start drawing in a completely unnatural way, acting the part of being the artist. So I discovered it's essential that when I'm doing that kind of animation, it's on my own in the studio. Is the time to stop, do you think? No. Okay.
Since you have no problem with uncertainty and misreading to a degree, maybe I'm misreading this, but the Documenta film, at one point, there's that caricature of the woman with the 2 lovers that was used. Yes. And I was wondering at that point, given sort of race relations in South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, if those are uncomfortable moments for your audience in South Africa, how has the reception been on?
There's a melodrama, like a silent film made in 1905, the era when Einstein was doing relativity, if one had to. So which was obviously when one thinks of it, a very advanced science and very primitive cinema. No, it's interesting that certain people looking at the films, in one of the animated films, the charcoal animation film, there's a woman in the film, and I used a friend who's an actress, who's a black South African as the model, and for me it's completely clear that's who she is. And somebody came up to me after and said, why don't you use a black woman for once